There is one thing a narcissist will never, ever admit to you. It's a secret they will guard for their whole life, hiding it behind every trick in their arsenal. The charm, the sudden explosions of rage, the cold silences that stretch on for days, and even the tears that mysteriously appear only when it benefits them most. But today, that secret comes out into the open. Here's the truth nobody tells you. A narcissist isn't scared of your anger. Your tears don't move them the way you think they do. Even your threats to walk out the door don't really rattle them because they've weathered all of that before more times than you could count. So what is it that actually terrifies them at the core? What shakes the shaky, hollow foundation they've built their entire identity on? It's the exact second you stop reacting. It's that moment when you finally see them for who they really are, when your eyes stop pleading for explanations and start simply observing calmly without needing anything from them anymore. Because right there in that quiet instant, something they've relied on for years starts to crumble. The illusion cracks open, and whatever web of manipulation, control, and quiet domination they've been running suddenly realizes it has lost its food source. It's staring at someone it can no longer feed on. That's the exact point where a narcissist begins behaving in ways that are strange, specific, and almost predictable if you know what to watch for. And once you learn to recognize those patterns, you'll understand something that most people go their whole lives without ever figuring out. The narcissist was never actually the one holding the power. You were. They just worked very hard to make sure you never realized it. Before we go any deeper into this, do yourself a favor. If you've ever been manipulated, gaslit, or emotionally wrung out by someone who insisted they loved you, stick around and follow along because what's coming next might completely change how you view every narcissist you've ever encountered in your life. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you replayed an argument in your head trying to figure out what you did wrong, only to realize weeks later that you did nothing wrong at all? How many times did you apologize first, just to keep the peace even when you weren't the one who broke it? That constant confusion wasn't an accident, it was the design. A narcissist doesn't win by being smarter than you. They win by making you doubt the one thing you should never doubt, your own perception of reality. And the wildest part is that most people who go through this never even realize it happened until years later, when they finally step outside the fog and look back at what their life actually looked like while they were inside it. Here's something most people never grasp. Narcissists don't operate on love, and they don't operate on logic. And honestly, they don't even really operate on hatred. What actually fuels them is control. Control is the air they breathe. It's the only thing that quiets that bottomless emptiness sitting inside them. And the way they get their hands on that control is by studying you, closely and patiently. They study your fears. They study your hopes. They study your old wounds, your loneliness, and that deep human need everyone has to finally be understood by someone. Then, once they've mapped all of that out, they position themselves as the perfect answer to everything you've ever felt was lacking in your life. That's exactly why things felt so intoxicating and magical when it all began. It wasn't love, it was reconnaissance. They were quietly mapping every corner of your soul, so they could use that map against you later, whenever it suited them. And the moment you start healing, the moment you start rediscovering who you actually are, that map they spent so long drawing becomes useless overnight. Their power over you begins to die right along with it. This is why so many people describe the beginning of these relationships as feeling like a fairy tale, almost too good to be true, because it was engineered to feel that way. Every compliment was calculated. Every act of generosity was an investment. Every late night conversation where they seemed to get you, like no one ever had, was really just data collection dressed up as intimacy. It wasn't real closeness. It was a performance so convincing that even they sometimes seemed to believe it, at least for a little while. And that's part of what makes the eventual unraveling so disorienting. You're not just grieving the loss of a relationship, you're grieving the loss of a person who in many ways never actually existed outside of the role they were playing for you. That's precisely when their behavior starts shifting in ways that can feel bizarre to witness if you're not prepared for it. Pay close attention here because this is where everything starts to make sense. When a narcissist senses that their grip on you is slipping, they don't respond with any kind of self-reflection or accountability. Instead, they respond with panic dressed up to look like dominance. One moment they'll turn ice cold, and the next they'll turn sickly sweet, almost overnight. They might vanish without a single word of explanation, or they might suddenly flood you with an overwhelming amount of attention you never even asked for. They'll pick fights over absolutely nothing. They'll dredge up old wounds you thought were long buried. They'll accuse you of things you never actually did. They'll rewrite entire chapters of history right in front of your eyes, fully expecting you to flinch, to second-guess yourself, and to shrink back down into that small, familiar shape they carved out for you years ago. And when you don't fold, when you stay steady, when your expression remains calm, when you simply don't give them the reaction they're fishing for, something inside them starts to come undone. That's because their entire sense of identity is built on your reaction to them. Without it, in a strange way, they cease to exist. Here's a part of this that almost nobody talks about openly. A narcissist isn't a powerful person putting on an act of weakness. It's actually the reverse. A narcissist is a deeply frightened person putting on an elaborate performance of being all-powerful, almost godlike. Strip away the arrogance, the cruelty, and the icy distance, and underneath it all, you'll find a scared child who never learned how to feel safe inside their own skin. That's the real reason they need to dominate everyone around them. That's why they need to humiliate people. That's why they crave being admired, feared, and obeyed without ever being questioned. And when someone like you, someone who has done real inner work, someone who has finally started valuing themselves, walks into their orbit and simply refuses to bow down anymore, the narcissist experiences something close to genuine existential terror. For maybe the first time in their life, they're forced to confront the exact thing they've spent decades running from: their own emptiness, their own smallness, and a shame so deep they've buried it under layers of performance. And what unfolds after that tells you everything you need to understand about them. The first warning sign that a narcissist is losing their hold on you shows up as sudden, irrational rage. Not the kind of anger that makes logical sense given the situation. Rage that erupts out of nowhere, wildly disproportionate to whatever supposedly triggered it, and often directed at something so small it's almost laughable. A certain tone in your voice, a text you didn't answer fast enough, a boundary you set calmly and gently, a joke of theirs you didn't laugh at. None of that rage was ever really about what you did in that moment. It was about what you stopped giving them. You stopped supplying fear, you stopped supplying submission, you stopped feeding them the emotional supply they'd grown so used to pulling out of you. So they escalate because in their distorted mental framework, if charm has stopped working on you, then intimidation is the next logical step. And if intimidation fails too, then in their mind, outright destruction becomes the only option left. The second warning sign is a sudden and total withdrawal. This shows up as the silent treatment, an icy cold shoulder, disappearing acts, or a hollow blank stare across the room. To someone who hasn't been through this before, it might look like plain indifference. But what's actually happening underneath the surface is the exact opposite of calm. They're punishing you. They're trying to make you feel invisible, discarded, and desperate enough to come crawling back. They're testing whether that old wound buried inside you, the fear of not being loved, not being chosen, not being enough, is still raw enough to pull you back toward them on your knees, begging. And if you manage to stay grounded through it, if you refuse to chase them down, if you don't break the silence first, you've just done something a narcissist genuinely cannot handle. You've proven to them without saying a word that their absence doesn't destroy you. That's a blow to their ego they'll be nursing for a long, long time afterward. But it gets even darker from here. The third warning sign is blame shifting so exaggerated it almost becomes theatrical. All at once, every single problem in the relationship somehow becomes your fault. Every cruel thing they said was apparently you're doing because you provoked them into it. Every lie they told happened, they'll claim, because you didn't trust them enough in the first place. Every betrayal occurred in their retelling because you simply didn't love them the right way. This isn't really a disagreement or an argument at all. It's closer to a psychological operation. The narcissist is trying to reinstall the same old programming of guilt, shame, and self-doubt back into your mind piece by piece. Because without that programming quietly running in the background of your thoughts, you become impossible to reach, you become unbreakable, you become genuinely free. And freedom in someone they used to control completely is a threat they simply cannot allow to exist peacefully. The fourth warning sign is the smear campaign. Once every attempt at manipulating you directly has failed, the narcissist pivots outward. They start talking about you behind your back, to friends, to family members, to co-workers, and sometimes even to your own kids. They'll paint you as unstable, cold, selfish, ungrateful, maybe even a little unhinged. And they do it so smoothly that even people who've known you for years start looking at you with confusion, wondering which version of the story is true. Here's the part most people caught in this never fully understand while it's happening. The smear campaign was never really about damaging your reputation for its own sake. It's an attempt to rebuild the cage around you. Because if they can convince the people around you that you're the problem, maybe, just maybe, they can eventually convince you of the same thing. Really, the smear campaign is nothing more than the desperate, panicked howl of a predator who has lost its prey and is scrambling to get it back. What makes these four signs so disorienting when you're living through them is that they rarely show up one at a time in a neat, predictable order. Often they blur together, cycling through in a matter of days or even hours. Rage on Monday, silence on Tuesday, a tearful apology on Wednesday that somehow turns into you comforting them, blame by Thursday. And by the weekend, a version of the smear campaign quietly playing out in a group chat you're not part of. Living inside that cycle is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it firsthand. Your nervous system never gets to fully relax because it never knows which version of them is going to walk through the door next. That constant unpredictability isn't a side effect of the dynamic. It is the dynamic. Confusion keeps you close. Certainty would set you free, and certainty is exactly what they can never afford to give you. If any part of this is landing close to home, if something in you is recognizing pieces of your own story here, stick with this because what comes next is going to help you reclaim exactly what was taken from you. Most people never stop to consider that emotional independence is the single most threatening force a narcissist will ever face in their life. Not money, not status, not even the fear of you finally leaving for good. It's emotional independence, plain and simple. The instant you stop needing their approval, their validation, their attention, or their permission to feel okay about yourself, you effectively cut off the exact cord they'd been feeding through this whole time. And a narcissist without a feeding source turns into a genuinely unstable creature. That's the real reason they get more aggressive, not less, once you start healing. Because in their mind, your healing represents their starvation, your peace represents their famine, your self-respect represents their exile. They don't actually want you to be well. They want you dependent on them. They want you reactive, on edge, needing them to regulate your emotions for you. The healthier and more grounded you become, the more dangerous you become to the version of you that lives rent-free inside their head. Pay attention here too, because this next part changes how you see everything. Boundaries aren't walls that shut people out. Boundaries are mirrors, and a narcissist absolutely cannot stand mirrors. Every single time you set a boundary, no matter how softly or gently you phrase it, you force them to see themselves with total clarity. You force them to confront the fact that you exist as a whole person with your own soul, your own center, something that lives entirely outside their control and was never actually theirs to command in the first place. That reality is unbearable for them because in their internal world, you were never truly a separate, independent person to begin with. You existed as a function, a source of supply, a source of admiration, a tool for regulating their own emotions. And the moment that function starts saying no, the moment it starts developing a life and will of its own, the narcissist experiences something close to a massive betrayal. That's exactly why they respond to boundaries almost the same way most people would respond to actual physical violence, because to them, a boundary genuinely feels like an act of violence. Your refusal to comply reads to them as the total collapse of their entire universe. This is also why so many survivors describe feeling guilty the first few times they hold a boundary firmly, even when they know logically that the boundary is completely reasonable. That guilt isn't a sign you're doing something wrong, it's a sign that you're finally doing something they never taught you how to do while you were under their influence. The guilt fades with practice. What replaces it is something sturdier, a quiet confidence that doesn't need to explain or defend itself to anyone. You'll notice, too, that the more consistent you become with your boundaries, the less energy the narcissist seems willing to spend trying to test them. Not because they've changed, but because a boundary that never moves eventually stops looking like something worth pushing against. Predators conserve their energy. They go where there's still a chance of a meal. Here's something else nobody really talks about. Underneath every single narcissistic behavior, every insult, every cold silent treatment, every guilt trip, every lie, every smear campaign, every sudden burst of rage, there's one emotion sitting at the very root of it all, and that emotion is fear. The narcissist lives in a constant, low-grade state of fear. Beneath the confident mask they show the world, they're carrying an ongoing sense of psychological dread. They dread being exposed for who they really are. They dread being truly seen. They dread being ordinary, unremarkable, unspecial. They dread being abandoned. And most of all, they dread confronting the reality that the self they've spent a lifetime constructing is completely hollow at its core. The only way they know how to manage that dread is by pushing it outward, forcing someone else to carry the weight of it for them. For a long stretch of time, that someone was you. And the reason your healing terrifies them so profoundly is that the moment you finally set down the fear they handed you, they're left with no choice but to feel it themselves. And they will choose to destroy you completely before they ever choose to sit with that feeling on their own. Once you truly absorb all of this, you start to see every single one of their behaviors in a completely different light. The sudden rage was never strength. It was pure panic wearing a mask. The cold silence was never real power. It was a punishment born straight out of fear. The blame shifting was never confidence. It was a desperate attempt to keep their mask glued firmly to their face. And the smear campaign was never real influence. It was simply the sound of someone losing their grip on reality entirely. Suddenly, that terrifying giant you were once so afraid of starts to look exactly like what they always were underneath it all, a deeply frightened person screaming from inside an elaborate costume they built to hide from themselves. And once you see that clearly, there's no going back to not seeing it. And once you can no longer unsee it, you can no longer be controlled by it either. But here's where things get even more revealing. The narcissist's deepest fear was never really you walking out the door. Their deepest fear is you becoming someone they no longer even recognize. Because the version of you they claimed to love was the version that desperately needed them, the version that doubted her own gut instincts, the version that apologized way too fast, way too often, the version that gave too much of herself away, forgave far too easily, and stayed far, far too long in a situation that was hurting her. When you transform into someone who genuinely knows her own worth, someone who moves through life with a calm center, speaks clearly and plainly, sets firm boundaries without drowning in guilt, and actively chooses peace over endless chaos, that new version of you becomes a total stranger to them. And total strangers can't be manipulated using old wounds, because those old wounds belong to a version of you that no longer exists. The new you has rewritten the rules of engagement entirely, and the narcissist simply doesn't have the tools to read this new language you're speaking. This is exactly why your healing represents the single greatest threat a narcissist will ever face. Not your revenge, not exposing them publicly, not even your physical absence from their life. It's your healing. Because revenge can be twisted into a story about your cruelty. Public exposure can be spun to others as your lingering bitterness. Even you leaving can be reframed in their mind as their own sudden liberation from you. But genuine healing can't be touched by any of that. Healing can't be spun into a lie. Healing can't be argued with or debated. A person who has truly healed is like a sealed door. She doesn't engage. She doesn't chase after them for closure. She doesn't beg for explanations. She doesn't constantly justify herself to anyone. She doesn't perform for an audience anymore. She simply lives her life quietly and fully. And in that quiet, steady, ordinary living, the narcissist sees something they can never have and will never be able to build for themselves. Nothing haunts a narcissist more than watching the very person they tried so hard to break walk calmly into a genuinely peaceful life, a life they themselves are fundamentally incapable of creating. Pay close attention here, because this changes everything too. Self-respect is the quietest and most devastating weapon you will ever carry through life. Not loud, aggressive self-respect that has to announce itself to the room. Quiet, internal, deeply rooted self-respect, the kind that never needs applause, the kind that simply refuses to bend for anyone under any circumstances. When you genuinely respect yourself, manipulation loses every surface it used to grip onto. Guilt trips slide right off you now. Gaslighting can't take root in your mind anymore, because you trust your own perception of reality far more than their distorted version of events. Flattery stops moving you, because your sense of self-worth no longer needs to be borrowed from someone else's hollow compliments. Threats stop shaking your foundation because you've already released the fear of losing something that was actively hurting you in the first place. Self-respect makes you completely unreachable in every emotional corner the narcissist used to wander through freely. And here's something nobody ever told you along the way. You were never weak for having been manipulated in the first place. You were open. You were trusting. You were genuinely loving in a world that taught you love should be reciprocated in kind. The narcissist didn't target you because you were broken, flawed, or somehow deficient. They targeted you because you were luminous, because you carried something bright and real inside you that they could never generate on their own. Warmth, depth, authentic empathy, real loyalty, and a soul capable of feeling things deeply and fully. They came into your life not to give anything, but to take, because they could never create from within themselves what you already possessed naturally, effortlessly all along. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with the longest, not the anger, not the grief, not even the relief of finally understanding what happened to you. But the quiet recognition that the very qualities they exploited are the same qualities that will carry you into a genuinely good life once you place them somewhere they're actually appreciated. Your empathy was never the problem. Your capacity to love deeply was never the problem. The only thing that needs to change is who gets access to it, and how much of it you keep for yourself before you ever hand a single drop to another person. Healing from this isn't a straight line, and nobody expects you to wake up tomorrow feeling completely whole. There will be days the old doubts creep back in. Days you catch yourself almost reaching for your phone to check in with someone who never deserved that kind of loyalty from you. That's normal. That's not failure. That's just the residue of a pattern that took a long time to build, taking its time to fully clear out of your system. What matters is the direction you're facing, not the speed you're moving at. And on the exact day you truly understand that reality, the day you stop viewing yourself as a victim of their cleverness and start seeing yourself instead as the actual source of the very light they were always trying to steal from you, something inside you shifts, permanently and completely, and it never goes back. From that day forward, you're no longer someone who survived a narcissist. You're simply someone living her own life on her own terms, and that more than anything they ever did to you is the ending they never saw coming.